Welcome to our AAPI Heritage Month event on AAPI executive leadership, reflecting on the journey and passing on the legacy. We have with us our special guest, Deb Liu, who is the CEO of Ancestry.com. Who here has used Ancestry.com? If you're willing to share with everybody here. Oh, very cool. Thank you for being with us. We welcome our Age to Society Board and Advisory Council and members here in San Francisco. We also just launched a new center, Age to Society's 16th center around the world in Seattle. We've offered this event to our members and friends there, and they're joining us via live stream. We will be taking questions from Seattle as well, so those of you joining from Washington State, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get them up to Buck G here in the front. For today's format, I will introduce Buck G, who is on our board and is our moderator. Buck will introduce Deb Liu, our speaker. They'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll have time for audience Q&A. And when that time comes, if you have a question, please raise your hand. If Buck calls on you, wait for a microphone to be brought to you. Please introduce yourself and keep your question as brief as possible because we want to hear from as many people as we can. We look forward to a really inspiring conversation with these two. This event is on the record, and we are recording, and we're going to post the video up on our website. At the end of this program at 6:30, we're going to try something a little bit different. We have a fun networking session that's going to be led by Christy on our team, and she'll come up here. And outside, we also have a book selling and signing with Deb Liu, and that'll be right outside those doors. We'll wrap by 7 o'clock. And now a few brief words about our moderator, Buck G. He is everywhere. Buck is regional chair. Yeah, you all know, all at the same time, you know. He's regional chair and board member of the Committee of 100. He is the board president of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. He's the co-chair of the Asian American Executive Program at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, co-chair of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation Donor Advisory Board. There are many more titles he has, but most importantly, he is on our board of Age to Society, Northern California. Please join me in welcoming Buck G.
Thank you, Margaret. I don't think I really want to introduce Deb because you can read about it in her book when you buy it later. But the first time I met, probably two stories about Deb. One, just to tell you who she is. I met Deb maybe 2005-ish or so when she was a senior vice president at Facebook, Meta, as it was Facebook at the time. And we had lunch, and after lunch, I left the lunch, and I thought, you know, she's going to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company one day, and she's halfway there, but I'm sure she's going to get there. The other show I want to tell about Deb is she has a voice, and the reason I say this, I've always been impressed with Deb, so it's a pleasure to be with her. But I once introduced her at a conference, and I said, so Deb at Facebook started a $1 billion company project, and she jumped in and said, "No, Buck, I started $2 billion projects in Facebook." So please welcome Deb Liu.
Much.
Okay.
It's wonderful to be here.
And we have an hour, and what we're going to do is spend the first half hour talking, and as we talked before, we can talk for more than half hour, just the two of us. But I'll try to have her say most of this, takes most of the time. And then the last half hour we'll take questions. And if there are no questions, I'll call on people for questions. But what I want to do Deb, in the half hour we have, is probably talk about three things. One is a role as CEO at Ancestry. The second is the Women in Product project, which I love, and we talk about it, and I think it's dear to your heart, and tells more about you than anything else I know. And then I'll spend the last part of the time talk about your book and why you write it and why you wrote it and what it means, okay? So if that's okay, then the first question is, how do you like being CEO?
Some people say that when they were kids growing up, they knew that this is where they're going to be. This was totally not me. In fact, when someone called me about even interviewing for my first CEO position, I was like, why me? I can't qualify. And they said, well, why not you? And, so it's been such a crazy adventure. And a lot of it is, I grew up in a small town in the South, and I just could never imagine what possibilities there were. I grew up in a place where no one looked like me. And I was the other, like somebody who's always foreign to everybody. And people used to come up to my family and say, why don't you go back to where you came from? Constantly. And it was just a really, being here now, I've come so far, and it's so, we tell the kids stories of what it was like when I was growing up, and they just can't even imagine, because, we live in the Bay Area.
So how did it feel? What did you do when people said, go back to your own country?
Well, first they would say, go back to where you came from. And I would say to them, New York. And they're like, no, where you really came from. I'm like, I was born in New York. I was a really cheeky kid. And so one of the things that, you just in your mind, you're like, I belong. And then when people tell you you don't, you realize maybe I don't belong. Maybe I don't look like everyone around me. And I remember my parents telling me this all the time, and I was very young. We moved there when I was 6. And I remember my parents saying, you might be the first and only Asian that someone meets. So you're going to, if you misbehave, if you do something wrong, they're going to judge the entire community of people like us based on you. And I was like, whoa, because you're 6 years old and you're thinking, okay, I got to be really good. But part of it was that it's that sense of like, you always have to achieve, you always have to prove that, they're like, you're going to have to work twice as hard to be as successful. Like they said all the immigrant things, right? And that's a lot to put on a kid. And so, part of that was when you feel like a foreigner, you're like, well, how do I belong? Like, how do I find my place? And part of me was like, if I just got smaller, if like no one noticed me, maybe they won't say anything. And so for many years, I was already kind of introverted. And so I just like got smaller and smaller. And I said, if I just work really hard and put my head down, like do the work, right? Isn't that what all of our parents tell us? And so they had a very strong immigrant mentality that I grew up with. And then you realize you can't get to be CEO or very successful in American society following those rules. And it was a really hard journey for me to get here.
So when did you change that? When did you just said, I can do that? Why not me? I mean, what caused that internally, right? Because here you are, a little girl from either New York or North Carolina somewhere, and everybody telling you, shrink, 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 shrink. When did you decide, what the hell? Let's do it.
Well, first, I'm from South Carolina, the state south of North Carolina. People used to be like, oh, what state is that? I'm like, the state south of North Carolina, where you've probably heard of. My husband actually grew up in North Carolina, and he's also Chinese American, and he's like, I come from the more genteel of the two states, I went to school at Duke, so it's okay. But I think one of the things that I when I was small is, you are successful doing the thing that they teach you to do, right? So for me, it was like, do well in school, right? Get a, good SAT score, graduate #1 in your class, get a scholarship to college. And there's all these rules that you follow. And when you follow those rules, you get to a certain place, and it works for us, right? Because I was a rule follower. And then you realize when you get into the workforce, like that's not how the world works, right? That there's a huge bias against people who are very quiet. There's a bias against people who don't look like the leaders. There's so many different kinds of, success, and people, value people who can speak up and argue and debate. And I just wasn't that person. And I had to figure out very slowly over a long period of time, I had to learn all these skills to be successful. And I wrote an article about finding my voice as an Asian American leader, which I published in Quartz. And before I sent it out to a few people I trusted. And one person who I really respected, but is also a minority woman, she's like, this reads like you assimilated, right? And I just remember, and I don't think she's not Asian American, so she didn't realize what the word assimilation means to us, because it means that you gave up your parents' culture, your culture, in order to fit in. And I thought about it. I sat on it. I actually refused to publish it for a long time. And finally, they were like bugging me. And I had to think about it. And then finally, I said, what if I didn't call it assimilation? I called it adaptation, which is how do we marry the things that make us great that our parents taught us with the culture that we live in today? And how do we actually make that what we are so that we can live our authentic selves in a culture that values things that might be slightly different than what we grew up with? And that's what I had to learn over a long period of time.
So, but was there a point that you said, where you failed, or where somebody told you, hey, you have to change or else? Or is that something you learned over time?
I think
because you went to GSB, they must have told you that.
Well, so I took a class at
This is
GSB.
Stanford Business School.
So we went to Stanford Business School, and one of the things that you take, there's this class called touchy-feely. And it's basically you sit in a room and stare at each other for like 5-6 hours a week, and you express your feelings to each other. You know how foreign that is to someone like me? And so I just remember feeling really alienated from my classmates because I was really introverted, but I was also like really different than everybody. And I felt really different. And there was a class where you had to, one of the classes was you had to touch somebody that you had feedback for, that you felt negatively about. So almost everybody in the circle touched me. And their feedback, so then you had to listen to what they had to say, and they're like, you're really hard to get to know. You're really cold. You're really different. And I was like, yeah. And, but part of it was I had to learn that was holding me back. Mm-hmm. And it took me a long time to process that class because, over the years I reflect and I realize how much that helped me get past a lot of those feelings. But at the time it was devastating, right? Your peers are telling you, you are failing to do a thing that was really important. And so over time, I did learn how to adapt, but I think that class was a reminder that I was always going to be the other. I was always going to be foreign to other people. And it was hard, and it made me feel like I was wrong in how I grew up and how I lived. And so I have learned over the years to soften those edges, but it was not easy.
I mean, being the other, I've always been the other, always been the one. As you said, grew up in a small town where by the time I graduated from high school, we were the only Chinese family in town, so we were the other. So what do you think about that now? I mean, we're still the other, right?
Well, I think.
Well, I mean, look at it this way. I mean, you're a CEO, and in the Fortune 500, it's like 10% of the CEOs are women, 2% are Asian, and I think there's only maybe one Asian woman.
Lisa Su, right? Okay. So you can name her because,
yeah. So you are still the other. How do you deal with it as CEO?
Well, it's funny. I walked into a CEO conference, and so, occasionally I go to these conferences. There was like 250 CEOs sitting there. I walk into the room, I look around, and there's like 11 women in the room. And I was the only woman of color, by the way, I was the only minority woman in the room. And I just looked around and I thought, wow. And I had to decide in that moment, like, what do you think about this, right? And part of it is like, I don't belong. Like, oh my gosh, like terrible imposter syndrome, right? You walk into a room of very successful people and you do not look anything like them. But I had to kind of take a step back and say to myself, you know what? I am the, only, minority woman in this room. I'm the only woman of color. But, if I represent well, next year there might be 2. And the next year it might be 3 or 4. But if I show up and I'm like, inside of my own head, if I don't connect with other people, who are they going to invite next year, right? And so part of it was I had to really kind of say, you know what? I'm going to be the first, not the only. And then the next year, by the way, we went to the conference again. There was a second woman of color, which was awesome. I ran up to her and I said, hey, it's so great to meet you. By the way, she was a little taken aback. And I said, well, there's 2 of us now. And so, but I do think that, it takes time because you feel like you don't belong. And, but you get to choose what to do in that moment. You can say, I don't belong here, and walk out the door. You can choose to say, I don't belong here. I'm going to close inside of myself. Or you can say, I'm going to show up the best way I can so that other people can see me and other people can come and say, you know what? She's doing a great job. We're going to hire more of these folks. We're going to put more of these people who are different than us on these boards. We're going to give other people, opportunities maybe we hadn't thought about.
I mean, it's actually similar to a situation when I was at Cisco, and I found out I was the only East Asian vice president of Cisco. And the story I tell is, I said to myself, if I don't fix this, no one else will, because there's no one else here but us, right? Yeah. And to your point, I don't think we have responsibility. We can have responsibility to lead and do that, which leads me to the second part of what we talk about, women in product. Okay, before being thought about as Asian, you're thinking about women. And tell us that story, because that's a great story. I
started out in my tech career. So I stumbled into tech. I kind of saw this tiny company called PayPal, and there was like a few hundred people. And I was like, I'm going to join the startup, right? And I kind of just stumbled into it. I couldn't find a job back in North Carolina, so, we decided to stay. And so I got this job. And at PayPal, though, the leaders, like all the product leaders were women. So the VP of product was woman. And then at one point, including myself, every leader of every product team was a woman. And, it was just like very natural. And it was 50-50 men and women when I was there. And then I went to eBay, also like the heads of product were women. And then I get to Facebook. And I wasn't even actually in product in Facebook. I came in product marketing. And because, on the technical side, you had to basically be a computer science major to be a product manager at Facebook. And so I wasn't invited in. And so later I was doing the job, and I was mostly doing the job of a product manager because I'd done it for so many years. And they're like, well, why don't we just make you a product manager? I'm like, okay. And then I walk into the room and I look around, there's like 4 women and like 60 men. And I thought, wait a minute, like where's all the women, right?
Very typical, yeah, exactly.
It's just very, it was a very kind of typical startup. At the time when I joined, it was like 900 people at Facebook. And so I just remember thinking, well, where's everybody? Like when I was at these 2 other companies, everybody was a woman, and a lot of leaders were women, and it was a 50-50. And suddenly I thought, something happened here. And so for years I worked on, okay, well, why? So at one point there was like 6 women. I was the only mom. And so, I was joking that, I had 3 kids, by the way. And I joked that we each have half a kid, but I had to go home and take care of all 3 of them. Because, it was just like, I was really different than other people because I was older. I had run teams, but I was much later in my career. And so one of the things we used to do is, because there's so few women, we started having dinners, and we hosted these dinners every quarter with just like interesting people, just to see, like, to meet other, like have our 6 people meet other people in the community. And eventually, hopefully some of them would want to join us, someday if we ever called them. And eventually, I realized something, which was, this community started growing and growing, and we did these dinners for 4 years. And we were sitting there, and we were talking about who's going to Grace Hopper, right? That's the big conference for women engineers. And we said, we should start our own product conference. I don't know if you sit at dinner with strangers.
Your own conference?
Yes, just like out of whim, we're like, hey, why not? And so we said, okay, so a group of people, about 10 people at that dinner who had just met each other, started a conference. And when we did it, we were like, okay, well, no one's going to, I had these events planners who were helping us from Facebook because they were hosting it. And they were like, well, at least just tell us what you want to do. And we're like, we're going to invite people. And they're like, no one's going to come to a conference that no one's ever heard of. Maybe you should just do like an event, like an evening event. And we're like, well, we already promised.
Low expectations.
Low expectations. And we're like, no, we're going to do this. So we said, okay, we'll have 300 slots, and 3,000 people applied. And we thought, oh, there's a community here. So then we started a community. We now have 30,000 people, and there's 24 chapters across the world. It has been just a crazy adventure. And now we partner with all these companies, and we've had such support from the community, because what ended up happening, and much, much later we found out, that the reason why there were so few women, and now like the community had shrunk from 50-50 to much lower, is actually one company, Google, in 2004 decided they run to require computer science degrees for their product managers. And they were the hot tech company, and everyone followed suit. And so only 18 to 20% of computer science degrees are actually earned by women in this country. And so folks like me couldn't get their next job. In fact, so many women couldn't get their next job. And so we have worked on advocating to remove the computer science requirement as well as the technical interview. And it's brought in so much more talent back into the industry. And a lot of women who left felt like they couldn't get another job. We lost so much talent, and we went backwards for so many years. And so we're trying to bring those people back in. And that's been the journey that we've been on.
So in tech companies now, and I looked at the data this morning. I always look at data. In tech companies, about a third of the white-collar workforce is women at Facebook and Google and Cisco, things like that. And because it's Asian Heritage Month, I have to bring up the Asian question. And about a third at the bottom, a third at the top. But if you look at by race, which is my question, my issue, turns out of the women, again, it's 30% on the bottom, 30% on the top. At the bottom, it's Asians is about 20%, and at the top, it's 10%. For white women, it's 10% at the bottom, 20% at the top. So half your job is done. I mean, you got women in and they're doing well, but now it's a racial question. Also, Black and Hispanic, same thing in terms of the distribution between top and the bottom. Very few of them, so that's the first problem. But also, in terms of getting at the top, similar to Asian women. So all minority women of color have the same problem. So it's a women of color problem. So can you do something there, Deb?
Well, one of the things I did when I was at Facebook was I did ask the company to include Asians in the underrepresented minorities for leadership positions. So while they represented a very large portion of the company, they were not rising at the same rate. They were not making it to director and up. And so they did start tracking. And again, if you don't track the numbers, do you even know, right? And so they started tracking it. They actually included it in the class of people they tracked and talked about as underrepresented minorities. And that, I think that that's really important, because if you don't look at the data first, as you say, we talked a lot about this, Buck. If you don't look at the data, you just don't know, right? And
no one looks at the data.
And so when you actually look at the data, you realize that people, you were saying 20%, of these companies are women, Asian women, and only 10%, the proportion is 10%, and especially for minority women across the board. How do we think about this, right? I do think that partly it's just, a lot of times we just say, well, we've made it, we checked the box. But actually, if you look at the data and you cut it in different ways, you see that there's still a lot of challenges. And those are challenges that we still need to face as an industry.
So I want to move to your book, and actually kind of follows some discussion we're just having, and read one paragraph, which is the setup paragraph, about the rest of the book. So this says, this first chapter is meant to disappoint you, upset you, and frustrate you. We just had a discussion on that. It is meant to make you feel powerless in the face of a world that is unfair. Because for the rest of the book, we'll talk about how to take an unequal playing field and adapt to it, and even thrive when there's boundaries. So I once had a conversation with, and I won't say who, but a leader, an Asian American leader, Chinese leader in San Francisco, and he was talking about, hey, there are 1.5 billion people in China, and we have no problem leading in China. We have a culture that works. Why do we have to adapt to them? Why can't they adapt to us? And your book says, because you got to, right? It's unfair, but deal with it, I think.
I mean, I'll give you a stat that I really struggled with when I heard about this. This was many years ago when it came out. It was men are promoted, basically men are seen as leaders if they're competent, and women have to be competent and warm, okay? And so there are just, in the 2x2 matrix of the world, there are men who are warm, women who are warm, there are men who are competent and women who are competent, and you just look at that, right? And so in 3 of the 4 boxes, you're cool, but if you're a non-warm woman, you are actually penalized in the workplace. And guess who I was? I was extremely unwarm. And
I think you said cold. They called you cold.
Cold, hard to get to know, disconnected, heard all the things. I literally had some of these things in my written performance reviews, right? You're hard to get to know. It's really hard to build trust with you. All the things. And, too aggressive, you're abrasive, those things. And I struggle with this because part of me was well, that's just who I am. Aren't we supposed to bring our authentic self to work, right? But what I realized was I had to learn this as a skill. I had to figure out how to succeed with the expectations. And yeah, is it fair? Absolutely not, because a man in my position probably wouldn't have been asked to do the same thing, right? But I also said, you know what? If I want to succeed, I have to understand what people's expectations are of me, and I have to decide for myself whether I'm going to adapt to it or not. And it was hard because part of me was this is unfair. Why do we have to do this? And yet, if we understand that this is what the criteria is, and I tell people, because a lot of people tell me, well, I'm an introvert, or, I'm not warm. And I say, you know what? If you had the job opportunity of a lifetime, you're going to go run Latin America for your company. It's going to be amazing, but you have to learn Spanish. You would go freaking learn Spanish, okay? Because that is what it's going to take. And so maybe you learn Spanish in high school, or you happen to speak Spanish naturally, and that's a huge advantage for you. Or you have to learn it, but you're going to learn it because this is the opportunity that you want. But it's a skill, and you're going to learn it. And so I think we make choices unintentionally. We just say, well, I just didn't check that box. But what if this were the dream that you wanted? And for us, success is often figuring out what the expectation of success in an American workplace is. And so, for example, if any of you have ever worked in Asia, it's completely different, right? It's very hierarchical. People, you're expected not to speak up. It's very different here. But if you go there, you have to conform to the work style there. And so why would you not conform to the work style here? And so I do think that sometimes we just give ourselves, and chapter 2 is like, don't give yourself a free pass, which we say, well, I'm introverted, or I'm not warm, or I can't do these things. Or we just say, you know what? This is my dream job. I'm going to go learn Spanish. I'm going to go figure out how to do it because this is the thing that I want to achieve.
By the way, I want to clarify one thing that I think that Deb and I share. I absolutely agree with her. But I think the other thing we do, and really the example was women in product. Fifth system is unfair, but we're also working to change the system to make it more fair. But in the meantime, you got to deal with it, right?
Yeah. Well, the other part is, I hope that by reaching a place where, I can lead a company where I don't expect women to be warm to be successful. Right? But if I didn't get there, if no one gets there, and you can't see different styles of leadership, then we'll never get there together. And so part of it is when people reach that level of success, hopefully they can say, you know what, it's okay to be introverted. It's okay to be, different. And, but if no one ever makes it, how do we actually create that safety for the next generation? And so I do think that adaptation, not assimilation, is incredibly important for everybody to really find that level of success so that other people, the next generation, has it easier and easier and easier.
So what was the hardest thing you had to adapt to?
The biggest thing, honestly, is I am so introverted that, it was very hard to speak up ever, like to show up in meetings and actually talk, to have an opinion. Like I have lots of opinions, but I can write them down and send them to you, right? But an opinion where you have to stand in a room full of 20 people and defend your position in front of people who are very, very intimidating, who are clearly smarter than you, that was very hard for me. And it took me a long time to realize that if I didn't defend my position, if I didn't fight for what I was looking for, it was not going to happen. And so, but it didn't come naturally, though. And I think that's one of the challenges that I think a lot of us face, which is in the face of having to do this work of learning the skill, it hurt. When you're learning, it actually is painful. It's kind of like when you're exercising. If you're not actually feeling exhausted and pain while you're working out, you're probably not working out hard enough. So building that muscle requires kind of actually doing work that feels really uncomfortable at the time.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. And same thing for me. I went to a business school where half your grade was a class participation. And people ask me, what's the one thing you learned at business school? I said, I learned how to argue. And that's right, because it's what you do all the time. All you're doing as general manager, or I was, or CEO, all you're doing is not arguing. I
like to say persuade.
Persuading, well, I always like the word influence. Influencing people work for you because you can't tell them what to do. Influencing customers on buying your product, right? Influencing the press. All of that is whether it's arguing or doing, but basically finding your voice. And I like what you said about finding your voice. Number one, because you have to have a voice. You have to figure a way how to do it and be consistent with everything else, with your culture, with your family, with your personality. So are you the same person you were when you were, this introverted little girl in South Carolina?
Well, it's...
Or did you sacrifice something?
People ask me that. I was explaining my evolution to somebody who's on my team, and they said, do you feel like you're wearing a mask every day? You're so different than, you describe yourself from before. And I said, it's sort of like when you learn a foreign language, at some point, you're in your head, you're actually translating from English into that language, right? But, I grew up speaking Cantonese, and so I speak Cantonese with ease, and I just don't translate things into Cantonese, I just speak it. But I think part of it is once you inhabit something, you actually no longer translate it in your mind. It just becomes it's like a second nature. And I think that that's what practice becomes, that you inhabit that person. And so it's not like you are wearing a mask, someone else's, mask. It's that's who you become.
Actually, and again, I have to mirror that with a story that I have. I remember when I started working after business school, I'd get up every morning and I'd wake up and I said, okay, I have to put on my work face. Did you ever do this? Yeah, you have to put on your work face. And then you do it, and you do it. And then about a couple years later, I came home and was talking to my wife. And was talking to her, and she asked some questions over dinner time. And she said, Buck, take off your work face. Because I was acting like she worked for me, and she didn't like that. So the point being, it becomes automatic. It's part of you. You're not sacrificing, but I did have to think about changing. You ever had that problem?
Well, it was one funny thing was, so I don't like to be touched, and my husband knows this, and we've been together since, I met him when I was 18, my first weekend in college. So we've been together for a long time. And I was telling him I was in Seattle seeing my team, so we had the Seattle group here. So I had a big team in Seattle back then, and I used to travel there, and I'd given up a team, and I went back like maybe 6 months later, and I said, I saw all these people that I missed, and they all gave me a hug, and then he goes, stop. He goes, you let them hug you? You let them touch you? I said, what do you mean? And he goes, people actually hug you like physically? And I said, what do you mean? And he goes, you hate being touched. And I said, oh yeah, I guess so. And he goes, well, what changed? And I realized that it just had changed over a long period of time. And he just never noticed because he doesn't see me at work. But I was completely comfortable with what he would have considered, like 10 years ago would have been completely strange to him. But I think it is one of those things where as you evolve, you don't realize how much you're changing unless somebody goes, hey, this was you before and this is you now. And that's really helped me. One of the things I have is I had a leadership coach over the course of many years. And she always reminds me, do you remember when that was really hard for you? And for me, I can't even remember a lot of those things. And I look back at my notes sometimes and I'm like, oh, she was right. And so as you evolve, you become a new person and you just don't remember, how many of you remember when you were like 3 feet tall, right? And what the world looked like versus when you were 5 feet tall. And now, and so I do think that you just forget because you're living it every day.
So, I hate to bring this up, but there's a saying in your book, and it's "fake it till you make it," which recently, because of Elizabeth Holmes, has taken on a negative connotation. But I still like it. So did you fake it?
How about, as you're learning the piano, you kind of play it badly, but you're still playing it. So, you're trying.
You try.
Right?
You're trying.
And so you might not know everything, but you're giving it a shot, right? And I think but to get to mastery, to actually be excellent at playing something or to speak a language, you have to go through a lot of trying. And instead of saying fake it till you make it, it's really the process of trying and learning and failing and allowing yourself to do that.
So actually, that brings up a Maley Tom story. So a friend of ours, Maley Tom, was I'll finish the story, going to questions that she likes to tell. She ultimately was the chief of staff for Willie Brown, but she got there after a few years. She had worked actually for the chief of staff, and one chief of staff was fired or quit for Willie Brown. He's hard to work with when he was in the assembly. So she trained him. And then 6 months later, he quit. And a new chief of staff came in. And she trained him. And then after 6 months, he quit. And then another chief of staff came in. And after 6 months, he quit. And she trained him. And then finally, Maley said, I've been training all these chief of staffs for Willie for the last 3 years. I ought to be chief of staff. And so she goes to Willie and says, Willie, I want a shot. Why can't I be chief? And Willie said, I was just waiting for you to ask. Because she never thought she was good enough. But to your point, you got to try it, right? Even though you think you may not be good enough. And I won't say you fake it, but, give yourself a chance, right? That's really Maley's story.
And I love that
your story.
Yeah, well, I actually include the story as well in there because Maley, when she told me the story, part of it is, maybe he thought she was not ready until she had the courage to ask. Because it's a big job, right? To be his chief of staff, to manage his calendar. But I think the other thing was, I don't know if she thought she was ready until she was ready to ask. And so I always tell people in that section, I was like, if you're not hearing no enough, you're probably not asking enough too. Because what if he had said no to her 3 times, but would say yes on the 4th time, right? But what if he said yes on the 1st time? And so sometimes you just have to put yourself out there, but we are so afraid. How many times do your kids ask for like a cookie? And you say no a lot, but eventually they know they're gonna wear you down and they're gonna get that cookie sometime, right? Because you say yes just enough to get the cookie. And so the point is, kids know instinctively that they can get what they want by asking, but we're terrified to ask because a no sounds so bad. But in writing this book, by the way, I put a list of amazing people I wanted to interview for the book, and maybe like half of them said yes. And you know what? That's a really good hit rate. But half of them said no. But they were all very kind. They were like, hey, I don't have time to do this, or it's not the right time now. And that's absolutely okay. But if I had asked 0 people, what would happen? Nobody would be in this book. And so I think part of the work is like actually putting yourself out there. I had such incredible people say yes that I would never have had the courage to ask, but for the fact that I really wanted a good book and I felt compelled to do this. But sometimes you need the forcing function of like a reason to do it.
All right, well, speaking of asking, there's some questions that have been asked, and I'm going to have to read a couple of them, but if there are any questions from the audience, I think we have a runner with a mic or something. So the first question is for you, Deb. In your book, you say that difference is a superpower, that you explain how difference is and may you explain how difference is a superpower and ways that we can embrace our differences rather than feeling othered.
Yeah. Sometimes we just think, well, if we see it and no one else sees it, maybe we're wrong. But think about every entrepreneur out there, every startup founder who says, you know what, I see this opportunity. And a lot of people say, well, obviously a big company would have taken that opportunity if it were big, right? And so, but they believed, the reality distortion field is they believed more than anybody else that there was something there. And so for me, one thing that I did when I interviewed for Facebook is I pitched building Facebook Marketplace. And that's because I'm a mom. And I told you I was the only mom PM, but for years I kept saying we need to build Facebook Marketplace. And by the way, I built many, many, many things before I got a chance to do it. I was there for about 5 years before I started working on it. And when I used to just pitch it every chance I got, every hackathon. And I would say, well, we can have people buy and sell things from each other. We can build community commerce. And people are like, why would anyone buy anything on Facebook? This is a product that today has 1 billion people every month going to it. So clearly there's something there. But it was because I could see it because I was in all these mom groups where, what do? You have a ton of stuff, right? And you had to get rid of it. In fact, I had this rule, which was I would buy my kids a bike off of Facebook and then I would sell it back when they were too old to ride it. So it was like a rental service for me. It was amazing. And I realized, why doesn't everyone do this, right? And part of it was that I could see it, but it was trapped in these groups and a lot of people couldn't find it. And if we could just build a way for people to connect and do this. And so I could see something, but that's what your superpower is. You see something in the world that someone else doesn't see for some reason. And it happened in this company. There just weren't that many moms. And so that was the blind spot, But what is the blind spot everyone else has? And how do you actually say, I see that and I should trust my instincts and fight for it?
Okay, is there a question from the audience? If not, I'll read another question. Is there a mic?
Hi, Deb. So my name is Jay Bolus. I've been following you on LinkedIn for quite a while and a big fan. So excited to be here. Thank you. And thank you to you, Buck. So you had talked about a couple of words. A couple of words came up: assimilation, adapting. And I like to think of it more as redesigning, right? So I grew up as a kid that was always told to be quiet because I was the kid that wanted to perform in front of everybody if they came over. I was loud, I was obnoxious, and so I was constantly told good girls are quiet. And so I was also told that later on in life in executive rooms. You're too opinionated, you're too aggressive. And so, I had to kind of learn this skill and try to grow. So my question for you is, at what point, because you talked about, people adapting to get to a certain level so that you can redesign what it looks like to be a leader. But at what point do you adapt so much? And then you talked about having it be something that you kind of naturally become, right? That work face. But where is that line though, where it's adapting And if you look at like corporations, a lot of them, there's like some very narcissistic people out there, right? Now, I mean, that's not what you want to adapt to. So when do you redesign? Like, when is that moment where the shift happens, where you redesign? Yeah.
Well, I think part of it is reminding yourself who you truly are, right? Like deep down inside, is it your work face or is this really you? And who are you really? For me, it has been a journey, which is, really, as I say, adapting. A lot of those are behaviors, right? It's like not who I am at the core, but also like what behaviors I exhibit, like being willing to speak up. It wasn't that I didn't have the ideas. It was that I wasn't speaking up on them. It wasn't that I couldn't do the work. It was that I was really bad at actually what I called self-promotion, or, telling people what I did, which is what I always tell people, if you call it self-promotion, you're not going to do it. But if you educate your peers about what you're doing, that's like something else. And so I do think that, it's reminding yourself also that like, sometimes, you think about the last generation, the generation before, of people who were like us and what they had to do to get to where they are today, and what privilege we have to be where we are. And then how we can make it possible for the next generation to even exhibit more diversity in how they think, how they exhibit behaviors, that, that you can have a loud voice in the room and that's absolutely okay. That someone can be extremely shy and a leader at the same time. That, someone who's neurodivergent, who's like has a different way of thinking, can also be in the C-suite, right? I do think that as people kind of adapt and bring themselves to a place, then they can say, you know what? It took me a long time to get here. How do we make it easier for the next person?
I want to add one thing, and I'll say, first of all, get this book and read it, and because what it has in it is our pointers to things you need to adapt to. You don't have to be like the tall white guy with the big, boisterous, loud things, but there's certain things you have to do as an executive, as a leader, to influence or persuade, or whatever the word we decide to use, the organization to move in your direction. And I thought Deb's book has great examples of those, using real examples of people doing it. So, okay. Bing, and then over here. So, wait for the minute.
Hi, thanks, Buck. Thanks, Deb. It's so great to see you guys, and a wonderful and very inspiring conversation. The question for both of you. So Buck was talking about people who have the mentality like we have 1.5 billion, just 203 billion people, or 300 million people in the US, why we need to adapt. So in the similar situation, like people come from foreign country, like me, come here as adult, and they're looking to, leadership, how do we adapt? I just got appointed as the commissioner for Palo Alto Parks and Recs. Very small position, but first Chinese American, first Asian American. I was amazed. Palo Alto is now 38% majority Asian. And this is like first time. And also it's kind of intimidating. In the commission, there's former Olympia. There's actually 2 African American. We should learn from them. So the question to both of you, one is like, Deb, as a trailblazer in many of those situations, how you push yourself forward with other people very accomplished in the room and make your voice heard, and you are the only Asian in the whole room. And the question to Buck is the balance between, I try to push like Asian activities in Palo Alto, ping pong game in the park, karate and etc. How do you push your culture come from, but have a balance so that people don't feel, it's too much.
Well, I think one of the things, I'm from Palo Alto, so thank you for serving on the commission. One thing I look at is I'm not an Asian American woman CEO. I am the CEO of a company, and that's it, right? There's no qualifiers. That I represent my employees, my customers, that it is not my identity that makes me who I am. It is the fact that I serve my community, and that's the same thing for you, is to really think about how do you represent your constituents, who is everybody, not just the 38%, but everybody in that community, and how can you bring, what your special point of view is to the table, so that you're representing everybody who has a voice in that community. And so really kind of, I think sometimes we walk around with these qualifiers because people look at us with those qualifiers over our heads, right? Because you wear the fact that you're a woman or you're different, but I try to, in day-to-day life, like I don't look at myself and say, I am qualifier. I think I want to do the best job I can for my company, for my employees, and for our customers and our stakeholders, and that's the most important thing.
That's exactly the answer I would give. I never thought of myself as Asian. In fact, I have a friend, Denise Peck, who says, Buck, you're the least Asian American I know. Because I look Chinese, I am Chinese, but I don't act Chinese. I act like a white guy, I guess. But I recognize my responsibility as a leader in the Asian American community, so don't get me wrong there. But I never thought of myself, again, as a XXX. I was doing my job the best I knew how. Grow my company, get my people promoted, get them educated, get them, develop them, and advance their careers. That was my responsibility, my people, and my company.
Dennis from Shopify here. Thanks, Buck, and thanks, Deb. Also a big fan of your content, subscribe perspectives quite a bit, and definitely really appreciate your voice and also the stuff you put out when it comes to leadership. My question's a little bit more tactical. So in an environment where we're remote, hybrid, some companies obviously have gone back, how has your leadership style changed because of that, knowing that, some of the sort of people of color or underrepresented communities may not be able to adapt to sort of just speaking out, or especially it's tougher in a virtual environment, obviously. So I'm wondering, have you adapted your style as a leadership, and how have you been able to build trust in the new environment?
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that, we are changing the way we're working right now, and it's not clear how we're going to shake out. So one of the things and I wrote about this so you mentioned my blog Perspectives, about the secret bias no one talks about, and that's the, it's actually we favor people who speak up. That's a natural thing. And, it's not necessarily the people who do the work that speak up the most or vice versa. And we have to do some work to correct that. But in a remote and hybrid environment, that is even more important. So for example, one of the things I do, and I talk about in the article a little bit about some of the things you can do, is there are interrupters, or things that you can actually do as a leader to make a difference. So one of them is, I noticed when I was in my senior leadership meetings, not everyone was speaking equally. So then, and I realized some people felt less comfortable, some people were newer. And so I just said, we're going to put everything out to a vote, but I'm going to send it out ahead of time, and everyone has to vote in a spreadsheet ahead of time with their comments. And then we actually white it out. So you actually turn your content white so that other people, the only way to see it is to mouse over it. And we did that so that everyone's voice was equally heard before we went into the conversation. And then we actually looked at the summary of it, and then we talked about it. But then I knew what people's opinions were, and I could call out on them, right? And so it equalized all the voices, because some people could just take up 50% of the airtime, one person, and then some people, everyone else could take nothing. And it was really hard as a new leader to know how to adjudicate a remote kind of everything was on Zoom as well. And so part of the work we did there was that I wanted everyone to show up as an equal leader, whether you ran my head of engineering runs half the company in terms of headcounts. And then, there were others, some of them were more senior than others. And I realized that everyone just felt like they weren't sure what their place was. And I said, well, what if we all just had the same seat? And, what if we did that across all of our teams? That there is not just this intern doesn't get a vote because they're not important. If everyone got an equal vote and had an equal say, what would that world look like? And how do we actually hear voices that maybe have really strong and important opinions, but are afraid to say it?
I want to ask a question here before the next one. And I see you. Okay. Deb, in your book, you write about building alliances and turning mentorship into sponsorship. Can you explain that further? And what advice do you have for any leaders in the room who are looking to uplift their communities from their current positions?
Yeah, so I talk about the 4 types of allies, and that's basically the first 2 are mentors and sponsors. So mentors give you advice. They are kind of distant from you. They, when I was thinking about taking this role, I called a lot of my mentors and I said, what do you think I should do? And they gave me incredible advice. these are themselves sitting CEOs. And, it was so helpful. But a sponsor is something a little bit different. They don't just give you advice. They're the ones who are and one of my mentors, Scott Cook, is the founder of Intuit. He actually said, if you're looking for a CEO position, let me help you. I will call people if that's what you want. And I was like, wow, but that's a sponsor, somebody who's willing to put himself out there and say, I will go call on people and see if there's an opportunity out there. A sponsor is somebody who puts themselves out there and says, you know what, I will open the door for you. I will vouch for you. And I will take a reputation hit if something goes wrong. Now that's what a sponsor is. And so often, advice is valued as much as you value it, right? Because it's from people that you trust. But a sponsor is somebody who says, you know what, you didn't think you were ready for this, but I think you're ready, and I'm going to put you up for this either promotion or opportunity, stretch project. And that happened to me multiple times in my career, and those have been the huge step functions. When I had been a PM for maybe 2.5 years, my manager left, and the VP of product at PayPal said, she gave me his job. And I was completely unqualified to run this team. I literally had barely managed anybody. I had only been a product manager for a couple of years. And she said, I think you can do this. So why don't you try it? But if it had gone wrong, it would have been on her, because she took a huge risk on somebody who's really untested. But the point is, think about how much that advanced my career. And it's those step functions. If you have sponsors, those are the huge step functions that actually could make or break your career.
But why did she pick you?
She took a chance on me because she saw something in me. And, I think that often when I do this, when I've done this, and it's like you find somebody, you're like, I see they could do so much more. I want to give them this chance, because it's totally worth the risk. The safe bet is you pick somebody who has already had that position, because if they fail, you're like, it wasn't your choice. It was just they were terrible or something happened, right? But taking somebody who's like raw talent and saying, I'm going to take a risk on this person, is usually more of a risk on that other person. But when it pays off, it's so gratifying, right? Because you took somebody who was not the obvious choice and you turned them into the obvious choice.
There was a question here. Yeah.
Hi, Deb. I'm Grace Wu. I actually read your book and really love the book. I think one thing that was really great is that you share some of your struggle, and it was really comforting. Because I was thinking, oh, I'm the only one who's struggling. It's good to know that someone successful like you also had downtime. I want to ask you, what are some of the things or tools that you use, when you are encountering difficulties or setback? What makes you get back up and then show up again?
It's really interesting when I interviewed all these women, because including myself, I am convinced that the most successful people are not the ones who had the easiest path. It is the ones who bounced back from failure and learned from it and grew more. They actually use failure not as a stumbling block, but as a springboard to something greater. Because they learned something from it, they pivoted, and they moved forward. And it's that kind of, pick yourself up and move forward that I think distinguishes people from who are okay in their careers to those who are excel. And I've had, I share a lot about some of the challenges I've had. I went through a period where, I didn't get promoted for many, many years. In fact, when I had kids for 6 years, I was not only not promoted, I actually took a demotion. I almost left the workforce several times during that period. But that taught me so much about being a leader, that I'm a much more compassionate leader. And I could see the struggles of people who go through that experience. Same thing when I was at Facebook. Not only did I not get the job I wanted, Mark told me the second time I asked him, he's like, not only are you not going to get the job the second time or the first time, you'll never get that job here. And I kind of had to decide, what am I going to do with that? And what I decided to do with that is I was going to make the job I had the job I wanted. And in some ways, I did better work doing that than anything else. And so, the question is, do you let that thing crush you? Do you turn away, or do you say, I'm going to look this in the eye and I'm going to move forward? And so I do think we often feel so bad about what happens that it detours us. But if we just say, you know what, that sucked, you mourn it, and then you pick yourself up and keep moving, you'll find that you're stronger than ever before.
So I have a question here, then I'll give you time for more questions, for you to think more questions. Here's a two-part question, one for me and one for you. Buck, you wrote a paper called The Illusion of Asian Success. May you explain what that is and how this illusion prevents Asian men and women, especially women, from becoming executives? And then Deb, how did you overcome the racial and gender barriers entering executive leadership? So for my part, the illusion is this, and I'll give you a simple example. There's one tech company in Silicon Valley who 51% of the white-collar workforce are Asian. And that's great. That's successful. That's incredible, okay? In addition, about 20% of the executive leadership is Asian. Okay, that's also great because people look at, 6% of the population, 13% of the actual white-collar workforce in America, so 20% at the top is pretty good. I seem to be the only one doing the math, looking at the 20% versus 50%, and seeing that the promotion rate is half of white men or women and less than Black or Hispanic men or women. So to me, being promoted at a lower rate is not success. So that's my view. That's my success. But it's great. In fact, we're so great that more often than not, the word Asian is not in DEI reports because we're considered not part of the underrepresented minority, and we're not underrepresented per se. So your question, so how did you overcome the racial and gender barriers?
I think we don't obviously talk about this, but I had such incredible allies. And that was so powerful. And I think we have this illusion of succeeding alone, right? Like you get to the top of the mountain, you climbed it alone, and except that, you had a Sherpa who carried all your stuff all the way up, and they get no credit for, like you look at people climbing Everest, like the people who actually do all the work get no credit because they're the ones behind the scenes. And, part of it is that no one succeeds alone. And I had so many incredible mentors and sponsors and teams and people who made it possible. And I think that we just underestimate that. But, success in a career is a team sport. It is not an individual thing. And it is, one of the most important things that helped me was I have an incredible husband, and, I could not have 3 kids and, and have the career that I have without a lot of support from him. But I also had so many people, managers who said, I see you. I see the struggle that you have. One of my managers said to me, you don't have to do this alone. Like, look at our peers. Like, most of them have stay-at-home spouses. Like, why do you feel like you have to do this alone? And this was a time when I had a colicky baby, 2 toddlers, and my dad was in hospice. And I almost quit my job then and left the workforce because of that. But because he saw me and he picked me up and he said, you know what? This is, we can carry forward. And part of it is he saw in me something, because part of it is his kids are half Asian, right? And his daughters will live a life closer to mine than his. And he saw what the possibilities there were. And because of him, I am where I am today. And so many people like that. I talked about my previous manager. And so I do think, to overcome, we have to work together. We have to help each other. We have to have allies. And it's not a solo sport. And I think sometimes we have this kind of idea that if we can't do it alone, we couldn't do it. But instead, let's look at this as a community, that we as a community, but we can help each other so much. And if we can just open up ourselves to the possibilities of being leaders together, that we can help each other, that we can find allies both within our community and outside of it, that there are so many people willing to help. But first, we have to be open to it.
I think that ties to a point about relationships. I mean, you're saying, you shouldn't be alone. You should build allies. To me, it's just relationships. And on one hand, it's anti-cultural. On the other hand, it's very cultural. That is to say, in Asian cultures, in particular Chinese cultures, it's all about, I'll say, family and relationship with the family, right? And rely on the family to support you, to help you, to guide you. And that's kind of it. So it's very Asian to rely on relationships. But on the other hand, outside the family, right, you distrust typically in Asian relationships. Here, you need to do that because when you're working in a company, that is your family, right?
And it's really about building that connection, right? When we talk about family is about connection. And in their workplace, if you're not connecting with other people, and going back to what I said, the part is, people said it's really hard to get to know you. It's hard to connect with you. And that you're alienating people who could potentially be your allies, your team, the people who can support you. And so, really kind of driving towards connection is so important because that gives you such a leg up.
And so that should be, if you're trying to reach the top, that's part of your job. Right? And I was thinking as CEO, that's part, especially moving into a new company. Is that job number 1?
Absolutely. I mean, the first thing I did when I first got there was to meet with, did one-on-ones with like 60 people in 1 month. And I wrote up all the notes. I asked them the same 5 questions. By the way, I published it on my blog if you want to read it. And at the end of the first month, I wrote a State of the Union, which was a reflection on what everyone told me. and what I learned from that experience. And, but building that connection allowed me to go back. Like any of those people could reach out to me. I could reach out to any of them. And it was just, I think a lot of times leaders come in and they hunker down with their leadership team, but instead I actually wanted to hear from as many people as possible. And that connection has only carried me forward throughout the last couple of years.
With that, I think we're out of time. So Margaret, I think you're supposed to wrap up here. Welcome, Margaret.
Well, let's hear it for Deb and Buck.
Thank you.
It is really, you're both very busy doing a million things, but it is so important to share your stories with the people here. We're going to post this video. You've shared your experiences with us, and you're paving the way for all of us. So thank you for all of the work, and it really means a lot for you to be up here with us today. Thank you again. We also appreciate you being here for AAPI Heritage Month with us. And for our audience, please check our website for our upcoming programs. We host events in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, now in Seattle, and we also do it virtually online. Up next, 4 programs to tell you about. We have a virtual executive roundtable on U.S.-China relations and investment in Asia. That's on June 5th. That's going to be hosted by our Seattle Center. It's the first program we're doing with our 2 centers. We have a half-day India conference on June 15th in Silicon Valley. We have an event on APEC 201, very important. They're coming to San Francisco in November. Matt Murray from the State Department's coming out from DC. That's on June 21st in San Francisco. And we have an executive roundtable with Jessica Chen Weiss on the latest on China. That's going to be June 23rd in San Francisco. And we're also going to have her in Seattle in person on July 6th. If you're not already a member, please join us. You get 50% off ticket prices and early access. And I do want to thank our team. They've been working very hard on all of these programs. Christy, Nina, Mon, Jeremy, Mackenzie, Aaron, and thank you to all of our interns. Let's hear it for all of them.